what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to provide a kind of chronological timeline and overview of the acquisitions of James Baldwin materials at the Beinecke, stretching back several decades. And as I do that, I will contextualize it a little bit in terms of both bringing Little Man back into print and my own current project. But what I really hope to do is to talk about how these primary sources are an incredible resource for us scholars and writers, but also hopefully for other interested readers. And what I want to convey, if I can, in this virtual space, is kind of the tactile nature of like how amazing it is to be in the Beinecke, actually reading the letters carefully, of course, and requesting other materials, photographs. It's just an extraordinary privilege and opportunity. So thank you again. So I'll be sharing a few clips along the way, but none of them are longer than a couple minutes. And I definitely want to take questions at the end, as I'll be moving fairly quickly through this timeline. Okay, so it was actually in 1963 that the Beinecke was built, or it opened. And it was 13 years later, 1976, that was an important year for my purposes today. Two things happened. The first was that Yale acquired the Richard Wright papers from his widow. And in that same year, 1976, Baldwin published his collaboration with a French artist named Joran Kazak on Little Man, A Story of Childhood. Included in those Wright archives was the draft that Baldwin had given to Richard Wright of what would much later, a decade later, become Go Tell It on the Mountain. And there's a great story that he writes about it, and we can talk about more. This was in the early 1940s. Someone knew Wright and sent Baldwin out to Brooklyn to meet him. They sat down, they drank some bourbon, and Baldwin talked about this novel as if he had finished it, when in fact he hadn't. He'd even come close. Wright said he wanted to see it, so Baldwin went home and quickly wrote 60 pages to bring back to his literary hero. And so those pages are here at the Beinecke. So 1976, then 20 years later in 1996, I was an undergraduate English major taking what I think was the first ever seminar devoted solely to James Baldwin's work taught at Yale by a young assistant professor named Maurice Wallace. And in that process, I decided that I wanted to write my senior thesis about Baldwin. I had read Baldwin in junior high school and high school growing up in Washington, D.C. My father was a civil rights activist and attorney. So I thought, well, let me go to the Beinecke. And for some reason, I did not find, they were deeply hidden, I think, the Baldwin drafts in the Richard Wright materials. But I did hear about this book, Little Man, an out-of-print children's book. And I don't think I'll ever forget going there for the first time. I hadn't been to the Beinecke, going down, filling out the slip of paper, passing it along, going into the glass-walled reading room. There were graduate students, very serious looking all around me, waiting there as they brought the book out. And this is another first edition of this out-of-print children's book, which nobody had really written about it. No one really talked about. And it was, that was the beginning of a long journey that I can talk about more, but not to go too far ahead in the timeline. But a few years later in New York, I had emailed actually David Lehrman, Baldwin's personal secretary and then early biographer, indispensable essential biography, seeing if he knew anything about Joran Kazak, this French artist. And he said he was one of the few people close to Baldwin that he'd never met. In fact, he thought he was probably deceased. But in 2003, I sent a bunch of emails off to art historians in Paris with my phone number saying, do you know anything about this artist? And the next thing I knew, the phone was ringing in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, and it was Joran Kazak calling me from Paris with a raspy French accented voice saying, come to Paris, I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. And thus began a kind of 20-year journey towards republishing the book with my co-editor, Jennifer DeVere Brody of Stanford University with Duke University Press in 2018. In just a couple of minutes, I'll show you a 2-minute clip from that, from our trailer for that book. But first, if I can share the screen and, where is this? Yes, share screen. I'd like to just direct you all to When I met with Joran Kazak in Paris in 2003, he pulled out and showed me an essay, a published essay that Baldwin had written about his work that I'd never seen anywhere else. And it's now available online. So I think we can put in the chat how you guys can access this. But it told the story of meeting Baldwin in 1959, introduced by their mutual friend, Buford Delaney, the incredible Black artist who was Baldwin's mentor and followed him to Paris, actually, years later. So it's a marvelous short essay, and I really, it's sort of quintessential Baldwin. So I encourage you to go to that website. It was also written right after Little Man was published in 1976. So more about Joran Kazak in the questions if we'd like, but for now I'd like to play for you this 2-minute trailer that we put together when Little Man came out in 2018. And you'll see there's some archival footage. You'll also hear a voiceover. The voiceover is done by Baldwin's nephew, Tijan Karefa Smart, the inspiration for TJ in the book. His niece, Baldwin's niece, Aisha Karefa Smart, was also an inspiration and was featured writing the afterword of the new edition. Here we go. I hope the audio works well.
Music all up and down this street. TJ runs it every day. Soon as he get a little bit older, he going to jump the roofs.
That takes place in Harlem. It's like the block I grew up on.
And what was the train version?
Little Man, Little Man.
Blinky, she just looking from across the street. Them eyeglasses blinking, just like the sun was hitting you in the eye. WT is 7, and ain't no excuse for him at all, skipping rope and following behind Blinky.
But the one thing a child cannot bear is to be talked down to be talked to in baby talk.
This street long, it real long. It a little like the street in the movies or on the TV when the cop cars come from that end of the street and then they come from the other end of the street. And the man they come to get, he in one of the houses or he on the fire escape or he on the roof. He's sweating and running and ducking, but he done for. He not going to get off this street alive.
Do some trouble for your books?
Did I run into some trouble for my books? Yes.
TJ real happy on Sunday mornings when his daddy be home all day and TJ and his mama and daddy all eat breakfast together in the kitchen. TJ's mama is the most beautiful woman in the world. I want you to be proud of your people, TJ's daddy always said. They boss people.
So you probably noticed that incredible archival footage of Baldwin speaking to a junior high school students in Berkeley, California. And I want to thank my co-editor, Jennifer Brody, for Stanford. She was able to track that down through a contact there, which was incredible. And it just, I'm going to go back to the timeline now at the Beinecke, but I just want to say, you know, Baldwin was so incredible on screen. And one of the things we'll get to is some incredible audio and visual material that the Beinecke has acquired quite recently and done a terrific job with. But anyway, back to the timeline. Okay, so it's 1996 when I discovered Little Man. I graduated in 1997. My senior thesis is published in an essay collection edited by Dwight McBride. 1 year later, in 1998, is when the Beinecke makes a huge, and it's a crazy story behind it, acquisition of what's called the James Baldwin Early Manuscripts and Papers. This is materials from 1941 to 1945. I don't know all the details, but I think it was an editor named Bert Kaplan bought a building or something in Philly. And in one of the buildings was a suitcase full of these James Baldwin materials. And now, of course, Baldwin traveled the globe with putting manuscripts and drafts in suitcases and duffel bags. So it makes sense that these materials would be there, but still it's pretty extraordinary that these materials were just found there this way. But they contain some incredible documents, including later drafts, but still early drafts of what became Go Tell It on the Mountain, juvenilia, including Baldwin's writing for the Magpie, which was his high school newspaper that he worked on with his friend and future collaborator, Richard Avedon. They later did their incredible book, Nothing Personal. So those materials are those were added in that year to the Wright materials. And the Beinecke has done a great job with this little clip that I think can capture the tactile elements of this better than I can in speaking. So I'm going to play this clip, less than 2 minutes, in just a moment. I seem to have lost that. I just played it for, oh, here it is, great. Okay. So again, this was in 1998, and it's just incredible how in the course of my lifetime, by looking at the Beinecke archives, we can see this extraordinary growth in resources for scholars and artists and writers around Baldwin's work. I should mention that, along with the Schomburg, the Beinecke is one of the two largest holders by far of Baldwin's materials in the world. So this was 1998 when those archives were acquired. Fast forward a little bit to 2013. This is when the Walter O. Evans collection was acquired from, and that collection, the Evans collection later would also include materials for incredible materials relating to Frederick Douglass that provided for David Blight's incredible biography. But in the Baldwin collection in 2013, we have an extraordinary cachet of letters to Baldwin's dear and close friend, who he dedicated another country to. So an American woman he met in Paris, and they became incredibly close. And he wrote to her from everywhere. He wrote to her from Istanbul, where you see my screen there is Little Man at the shores of Istanbul. He wrote her on his incredible journeys to the South in the US, his first one in particular, where he was being drawn inexorably into the civil rights movement, and he was somewhat traumatized, but also galvanized and driven. He writes to her from Corsica. He writes to her from Switzerland. So by looking at these letters, you get a real sense of something that's sort of central to my book, which is both like just the incredible, he called himself a transatlantic commuter. So the incredible breadth of places that he lived and worked, and where he felt he had to get away to work so that he could produce both the novels, but also the incredibly important essays, of course, that were so important to this country's history. So the Mary Painter letters, some of them are handwritten, some of them are typed. They're hard to put together because their addresses are from all over the place. But to just give you one example, in 1961, he wrote to Mary Painter from Istanbul. He'd just come there for the first of many times. And he'd been trying to write another country for years. And he said, I simply can't face the idea of carrying another country unfinished into another country. And luckily for him, he actually did finish it there. And in a remarkable line and prescient line, he wrote to Mary Painter, "Do you want the final manuscript of another country? It's yours if you want it. Speak now or find yourself eventually in a bitter dispute with Yale. It weighs several tons. It's absolutely illegible. If you want it, I'll send it." And send it, he did. And it did, in fact, of course, obviously, end up here at Yale. There's other materials. He annotates there's like his handwriting in the margins, annotating parts of the novel as well, which are interesting to look at. So this was 2013, but we weren't done yet. In 2016, 2017, David Lehrman, who I mentioned earlier, his collection, incredible collection of James Baldwin research was acquired. And again, he was his personal secretary and wrote a really important 1994 biography that has made the work of all of us continually possible now. That is an incredible, because David Lehrman knew and interviewed everybody. He was with Baldwin a lot in the 60s in particular, everyone except Johann Kazak, but he interviewed them, and there are untranscribed audio files with James Baldwin in the south of France just a few years before his death, David Baldwin, Baldwin's companion, Lucien Happersberger, many people who knew Buford Delaney, because Lehrman also wrote that biography later. So you have Buford Delaney's sisters being interviewed, his brother being interviewed. It's a cornucopia, I suppose you could say. And he also interviewed a lot of people in Istanbul. That's actually where Lehrman met him. Engin Cesar, fascinating, sort of famous Turkish actor who became Baldwin's collaborator and had played Giovanni's Room in an actor studio rendition when they met in Greenwich Village years earlier. But he also interviewed Sedat Pekai, who was a young photographer and filmmaker in Istanbul who became extremely close to Baldwin in the 60s and then into the 70s. And this leads me to another acquisition that Yale made in 2017. Wasn't the Beinecke, I don't think, it was actually the Yale Film Study Center. It acquired the outtakes, and the uncut versions and sort of audio from what ultimately became a short 12-minute beautiful film that Sedat Pekai put together called From Another Place. And Brian Meacham, I want to thank him for all the work he's done with that at the Yale Film Study Center. So what I want to do, I think, is play a clip not from those archives, but from the finished product, the film itself, which again is 12 minutes, but there's a 3-minute clip available, which I will play for you now. This is James Baldwin From Another Place, 1971.
I suppose that many people do blame me for being out of the States as often as I am. But one can't afford to worry about that because one does, you do what you have to do the way you have to do it. And perhaps only someone who is outside of the States realizes that it's impossible to get out. The American power follows one everywhere. But I'm not any longer worried so much about that. I'm worried about getting my work done and getting on paper, which is the best way for me, a certain record, which hopefully will be of some value to somebody someday. In any case, I have to do it, and it's part of the symptoms of this century that I can't do it very easily at home, or probably by this time, not at all. And in a way, being out, even temporarily and with the perfect awareness that one is not really very far out of the United States. Still, it's true that one sees it better from a distance. And you can make comparisons from another place, from another country, which you aren't able to make in America because there is nothing to compare America to when you're there. I don't really know what I am, you know, politically speaking. I never consider myself to be a leader. I consider myself to be a kind of witness, I suppose. I don't know. But my weapon, no, my tool is my typewriter, it's my pen. It'll be a mistake for me to try to play some other role, which I really couldn't play very well. So there we are. That's it. That's it.
So the rest of the footage that you see the water here in my screensaver, but there's lots of footage of Baldwin in a boat going down the Bosporus. Gorgeous footage. There's just footage of him, you know, at home in Istanbul talking, but also sitting at a table eating a hard-boiled egg. A lot of footage of that. So Baldwin, both the public figure, but also Baldwin the writer, Baldwin the human being, who had to get away to these places like Istanbul in order to, as he put it, breathe and feel human. And it's just so amazing to have access to this footage, especially at this moment in time, as we know, his words continue to be so prescient and meaningful. And it's why we have important books now, like Eddie Glaude's Begin Again. We have Amani Perry, who just won the National Book Award, but she also wrote a really important biography of Baldwin's dear friend, Lorraine Hansberry, and there are letters between them at the Schomburg. So Beinecke is part of this broader network, I would say, of repositories for really important Baldwin materials. And before I move to questions, I just wanted to reiterate the Schomburg as one of them, but also point people towards, who are not familiar with it, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has a extensive archive of Baldwin's, and a lot of that material is available online. So you can't get the tactile experience, but you can go in and see photographs, letters, drafts, and I'll just show you guys a little bit of that. Thanks to the scholar Magdalena Zaborowska, who has written 2 very important books about Baldwin. They've put together this extraordinary site called Chez Baldwin. So after Istanbul, his final years were spent in a house he bought in the south of France. That's a whole other story about how he wanted that to be an artist residency, and it ended up getting lost, but to some developers. But that's a sad story. Here we have the website, which we'll share in the chat, where you have access to a lot of photographs and stories that are, you know, in the south of France, but also of his family. There's a passport. So you can really get lost for hours. You don't even have to go to a library right away necessarily. And I think, especially when I'm teaching, I think these are great resources on the college level, but also high school and junior high school for folks who want to get more familiar with Baldwin's life and work.